All
All
right.
right, so yeah, we had that debate on the occult several years ago, and now that you're doing this presentation on Derrida and Wittgenstein, you have a some additional thoughts or some revisions of our previous dialogue concerning the occult, or what exactly?
Yeah, some clarification. When I was doing it, two things. One is when I reread what we had talked about, I think there were some points where uh, you misunderstood what I was trying to say, which is probably more my fault than your fault. And that allowed me to get clearer on what it is I'm really about with respect to some of the distinctions I was trying to make between the occult and everything else, or what I prefer to say of the occult and philosophy. And but it also applies, like you have said in your responses, the occult and science. Now, where I've gone with this is that basically my agenda has been for a long time, and it's come out in various ways in my writings. My agenda has been, how do communities organize themselves in a way to promote nonviolent community? And that's a simple way of putting um, what I'm about, because being a quote communication scholar, or at least having a background in communication studies, more so than say philosophy, um, communication is a big deal from my point of view and is essential to community. We need to have confidence and in investment in communication, but we also need to understand, I think, a lot of its potential pitfalls through the use of language. So anyway, I've gotten through my communication studies very much oriented in how do we organize community to, and then I look at a situation like what's going on, in Russia, Ukraine, and in the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, and it's just heartbreaking. It's just really, really tough to watch that stuff going on and just sit back and not be able to do anything, and and it reminds me of the questions I've asked myself over the years of, what is it that we can do to prevent this kind of slaughter that seems so unnecessary, you know? There's got to be better ways to resolve conflicts and get along than resorting to that sort of thing. So I know that's very idealistic, but I think it's also very pragmatic in the sense that, as a species, we just can't afford to keep doing this stuff because we're going to be sooner or later too tempted to toss around nuclear weapons rather than conventional bombs, which are bad enough. So, yeah, I think as a species, we need to pay attention to this and do some thinking about it. And so that's my agenda. And I think you and I would obviously share in that sentiment because I believe you to be a peace-loving person and a very committed person to the welfare of human society and the construction of human societies that benefit people. And so I think we're on the same page in that regard. And so I'm wondering, by talking, if we can get a little clearer on where I'm coming from in terms of what I was saying about the occult and say versus philosophy, and why it was that I was making a case, let's say, against the occult as being foundational for a community. And I think you were interpreting a lot of what I was saying along those lines as me being very much, you know, falling back into the positivistic emphasis on science and all of that, objectivity and evidence and replication and those things. Perhaps more so than I wanted to indicate, because it wasn't that I value those things necessarily more than occult approaches. What I was trying to say was that I I think as communities, because of the diversity that now resides in probably most global communities, there are so many people in communities from all parts of the world anymore, that through immigration, which of course has been a big political issue in a lot of countries recently, and all that. So we have a lot of diversity, and how do we as communities um, handle that, manage that with, and the conflict that often gives rise to, in such a way that we can have a stable community where people respect each other and get along with each other. And so my thinking on that is that, well, I look at American courts of law and I say to myself, well, what goes on in a court of law? What that seems to have been in the United States, at least, and probably in England and Europe too, to a significant extent, a fallback when there's conflict between members of a society or groups in a society. We take it to court. And at least traditionally, up to recent times, there's been a lot of reliance on the courts and a lot of trust. Okay, the legal system is, let's say, a place where I can go with my grievances and try to get some justice. And that tends to diffuse a lot of conflicts in society before they boil over into violence. And so I see it as a model. And then I ask myself, well, okay, what goes on in a court of law? Well, we have this thing called forensic science now, which is very dominant in many courts of law around the world. Rely on, and we see this played out in our entertainment dramas, the police dramas and the courtroom dramas, the forensic science. In fact, there's a TV show that focuses on these folks who are forensic scientists, and they analyze all of this information and show you all the technology they have for sorting out this stuff. Anyway, it occurred to me that that is an influence of science and technology, really, in our legal process. And so that is where some of the rubber meets the road with respect to science, and where science is at with its expertise, let's say. And it's not perfect. There's been a case here that my wife Christine pointed out to me recently, where there was a person who was apparently, if I remember right, it was living in the Denver area and working out of a Denver lab for processing DNA evidence in court cases. And it turns out that this woman had apparently, and I don't know all the details of how they discovered this, but she apparently misprocessed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, over 3,000 cases of DNA, and possibly made it possible for certain people to be put in jail mistakenly because she didn't do what she was supposed to do correctly at any rate. So the system is not 100% reliable, and mistakes, and whether intentional or unintentional like that, can happen. But it is, DNA science has been something that has, in many cases, come to the rescue and possibly prevented injustices by enabling, the production of proof that someone had to have been innocent of a certain crime. So there are pluses and minuses, but I, for one, am okay, let me put it this way. I think as a society, what the analogy with the court system is intended to do for me is to indicate that as a society, because of the diversity, because we have so many people of different belief systems, different religions, different backgrounds and cultures, that the methodology or the approach that we have used has been one of demonstration. You don't go into a court of law and succeed as a prosecutor in finding somebody guilty unless you can provide some compelling evidence to a jury of your peers. Now, these juries are not juries of experts. They're not juries of scientists. They're not juries of lawyers. They're just ordinary citizens collected together, and they're presented the evidence, at least in jury trials, and they're asked to evaluate it. And the evidence that is produced is evidence that is demonstrable. Now, by that I mean, something that can be shown. If you have an eyewitness, that eyewitness is there in court, and they can be questioned and pointed to, say, there is the witness who saw this crime, etc. And the jury can see them and they hear their testimony. Other things like DNA evidence, fingerprint evidence, was the fingerprints on the murder weapon kind of things, just material evidence that can be shown to someone, and someone else, let's say from another county, could come over and say, well, I question, whether so-and-so's fingerprints are on that, and say, okay, well, you test it. And then you can get some kind of verification, presumably if the science is working right. So that's what I mean by demonstrable. It has to be something that can be shown, and it's actually a medium of communication that people, ordinary people without extensive backgrounds in science and whatever, can see, can understand, evaluate, and have faith in. I mean, and I was going to give you an example. Like, for example, if let's say you were accused of a murder. You're just in your house, you're going along with your life, and all of a sudden somebody's accusing you of a murder, and you find yourself in a court having to defend yourself. And it turns out that the primary evidence against you is a person who claims to be clairvoyant. And they had a vision where they saw you very clearly committing the murder. They said, I've met Adam previously. I know him. We're not like friends, but I know of him, and I'm absolutely certain that I saw him committing this crime. And this is a good part of the evidence of the prosecution against you. And if you were on trial and your life were in the balance, and let's say you were in Texas, and the penalty for that would be execution, you would be concerned about the quality of the evidence being presented. And so
It's kind of like Minority Report. Have you seen that one?
yeah, although it's been a while now since I've seen it, so you might have to remind me.
They have precognitive. So it's not only that you did it, it's like they have psychics that know you're going to do that. So it's called pre-crime. So they'll
Right.
arrest you for crimes that you haven't even committed yet.
There you go. That's probably an even better example. Yeah,
Yeah.
I should have remembered that. But yeah, I don't know about you, but if my life were on the line, I'd be a little uneasy. As much as I've dabbled in occult phenomena, I would say when the chips are down, I would want some demonstrable evidence. I wouldn't want somebody coming in who is claiming to be a clairvoyant or have some sort of supernatural power that has determined that I am the guilty party.
Of course
Now,
not. Yeah.
admittedly, that's an extreme example, but sometimes we can learn from extreme examples. But
Yeah,
anyway,
I certainly I would never uh, advocate for absolute dogmatic certainty about anything, let alone something so amorphous as clairvoyance. I think that was something that we touched on in that talk a few years ago. But yeah, I
mhm.
totally agree with you so far.
Okay, so the distinction I've been working on is a distinction between demonstrable and undemonstrable, but not for purposes of saying which is better uh, in an overall sense, because I place a fair amount of value, as does my wife, in what you would call esoteric and occult knowledge and processes or structures or whatever. Astrology, I've been interested in astrology in the past and in current times. So there's a lot of it that I think has value, um, but I keep it on a personal level. I use it for my own personal information and processing of information, and so does my wife. And we would not you know, extend it to someone, let's say, who is uncomfortable with it. If someone is comfortable with that sort of thing, then free to talk to them about it and free to explore some of the avenues of it. But for a society that is under a government that has to have systems of instituting justice and resolving conflict, I think the occult, as well as the religious, which has been historically the basis for a distinction between religion and state, is that we want to have criteria that are not fundamentally lodged in religion or occult practices or whatever. We want it to be lodged in something that everybody can can sign on to, in the sense like demonstrable evidence. So that's where I was coming from in my emphasis upon the demonstrable as a kind of language or semiotics, if you will, that is something that we can show each other and that will help to install or instill confidence in judicial systems and the carrying out of law for purposes of nonviolent community. Um, because if you have something else going on, if you have, as used to be the case, I guess, in the Middle Ages, if you were brought before a king and or a magistrate of some sort, Pontius Pilate or whoever, and they decide whether you're guilty or not. Okay, this person gets nailed to a cross and this person doesn't, and that's that. Um, you want something more than that going on. Um, and that's something that will promote some confidence and some nonviolent community, I think. Now, what we see going on, and I'm just about ready to wrap up here, so you can get a word in edgeways.
You're fine.
But in Israel, Palestine, I see the crux of that conflict as being much, much deeper than, say, some cultural difference. This is a something that goes so deep that it's like a kind of what you might call a spiritual ideology. These people are so attached on both sides. Not everyone, but the radicals on both sides are attached to their ideologies to the extreme that, um, for me, it would count as a quasi-religious belief, or if it's not an outright religious belief. And this is getting in the way of there being an ability to negotiate negotiate their way out of this conflict. there's no negotiation that takes place. In fact, negotiation is considered to be a betrayal of some sort. And we're even seeing that a bit in this country where, in Congress, it's no longer considered permissible to negotiate with Republicans or Democrats, between the aisle. It's like it's all or nothing on issues like guns and issues like abortion and things like that. Immigration has been another one where it's, look, if we don't get certain things, that's it. We stop talking. And I'm like, wow, how did we get here? That's just crazy. You have got to maintain some avenue for negotiation. And that's basically what a court of law is. It's a way to have a structured negotiation and a resolution of a conflict. So, we're losing that. We're losing it around the world. So that's my fear. And I think one way to get a handle on it is to make this distinction about, okay, if we're talking government, if we're talking community, we're talking demonstrable evidence. And all of the esoteric things are fine, but they shouldn't be involved in these decision-making processes. So I'm very curious about your thoughts on that, and to the extent to which you might agree with me or want to modify what I'm saying in any extent.
Yeah, I mean, my esoteric occult interests are not about any particular ideology or philosophy. For me, they're not fundamentally different from anything else. They just tend to be more culturally defined. And so I'm somewhat familiar with, is some academic study of esotericism as a tradition and mostly just in Europe. And one definition is, well, it's just, all the rejected knowledge. And there's another guy that's like, well, that's not great because that makes basically occultists and spiritualists the losers of history, right? And I think that's kind of unfair because and this guy Eagle Aspirin points out in his book that like they've often been the same people. Like people have one hand in mainstream and one hand in stuff that's more alternative. They're not separate cultures. They're just kind of, for me, that the intuitive fringe of culture is what tends to be called the occult. And as it becomes more accepted, it becomes more mainstream. And it's not like they're fundamentally different things. Certainly you can, come up with examples that are very extreme and with a very stark difference. But yeah, I don't think that they're that different. There's other distinctions I do make in my work. Like I am interested in why philosophy has become very important for culture in contrast to the symbolism of more occult or spiritual thought. But that tends to be because of the extreme amount of abstraction and complexity of modern civilization, not necessarily because there's something deficient in the symbol systems of traditional or occult philosophy. So philosophy proper, like Western philosophy, I think you can make a distinction. Some people might say there's such a thing as Eastern philosophy, and I'm fine with using that word that way. But I do also appreciate a distinction that Deleuze and Guattari make that that philosophy is about the concept, and that it's actually very different than the symbol, which dominates a lot of traditional occult philosophy or systems. So, as far as courts go, yeah, I mean, I definitely wouldn't want somebody to just say they're clairvoyant and have that be dogmatically accepted. But I would say the same thing about any evidence, right? I think that's why evidence is only one part of an argument, and so the prosecutor has to make his case, drawing on evidence for sure, but also has to be persuasive about what it means. Like you and I both have a love of film, and yeah, one of my favorite films is I'm sure you've probably seen it, 12 Angry Men, where like they all go into the jury room and everybody's but one is but uh wait, who was it? Peter Fonda? No, Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda's character is the only one that's not convinced, and they're all just like, "Oh, well, there's eyewitnesses, case closed." And they just one by one he converts all the jury to see that like the eyewitness accounts are not as clear cut as they first seem, and so everything's always embedded in perspectives, and so evidence is good, but it also can be interpreted in many different ways. And so, one of my most important to me ideas that I just continually pound home and when I write is just that it's not about facts versus values. It's just that values are always in, basically putting facts in a different light depending on the value system, and it's a relatively straightforward reading of post-structural thought, and I would say even a lot of modern thought. It's just post-structural or postmodern thoughts, kind of just taking it a little bit further. But I kind of just take it a little further and say, like, well, there is no, if we're really going to take this seriously, something that Nietzsche just put pretty simply, of there are no facts, only interpretations, then yeah, then I think that naturally leads to a more occult perspective. And that doesn't mean some kind of dogmatic, clairvoyant belief system. To me, it just means understanding that perspectives come first, and that facts come out of contexts of value.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I think well said. Because yeah, like in even in courts of law, you have a prosecutor who will present evidence, and it's up to the defendant's lawyer to discredit that evidence if possible, and which is basically to yield an interpretation of it, which might cause the jury to put less credence in it. And it's all a process of interpretation. And I think it holds, like facts, like you were saying, are always in a context. And if you can restructure the context for the jury in a persuasive way to alter the meaning of the facts, then you can change the outcome of a case. And I think that's all part of all part of the puzzle of the judicial system, which I think is legitimate. I think it's important, however, yeah, to have uh, um, some place some value in the forensics. Say, okay, we have this evidence, but we still do have to interpret it, what it means, and that's the job of the jury too. So makes a lot of sense, and but I still believe that societies that organize themselves around at least the attempt, and Lord knows we've had substantial reasons over the years in seeing some of the court decisions that come out of certain areas to question the legitimacy of courts and the quality of courts and their decisions. And but at least we have a system where it's possible to, how did Derrida put it? It's open to perfection, endless perfection. We have to constantly put energy into critiquing it, analyzing it, looking at it. Is it working well? Can we improve it? Is there more injustice coming out of our courts than justice? I'm trying to get a handle on that as well. But I think there does need to be a process, and I think one of the crucial linchpins to that process would be what I'm calling demonstrable evidence. And certainly that does not mean independent of any interpretation. So if we seem to be in agreement up to that point, I would go a step further, and in terms of of attempting to put you on the spot for the occult in relation to let's say things outside of court systems. Let's say we're looking at what have traditionally been called cults. Now, the word has been going around lately that the followers of Donald Trump basically constitute a cult because it doesn't seem to matter what he does or what he says. Whatever he does or says is something they sign on to. It's like he's like a traditional beloved dictator. It's like Donald Trump can do no wrong. And in that kind of it's that kind of willingness to go down that road with someone in what I'm calling an autocracy, to lend yourselves to it, to give yourselves over to it, that troubles me about some of the esoteric traditions and organizations that have arisen over the last 100 or so years. And so I wonder what you would say in terms of how we handle that issue. If there are these practices which do feature, not entirely, but in some respects, non-demonstrable, let's say supernatural powers or supernatural entities, how do we avoid the trap that some people will allow themselves to fall into of just going along with what anyone says is the case? How do we avoid the autocracy of the guru? That actually the guru demon who is doing nothing more than manipulating you and taking your money and providing nothing in return.
I'm a big fan of this writer Bertrand de Juvenal, and he's a little bit on the far right spectrum when he was writing back actually during World War II. But he was also pretty libertarian. He's kind of a ambiguous figure, but a lot of people would put him on the far right spectrum. I think his books have been republished by like a libertarian publishing house or something, but he pretty much argues in a way not too different from Foucault about how modernity has actually been an increase in the technification of politics and of power, and that it's actually only further entrenched authoritarian structures. And so for me, like, saying this is a problem of autocratic leaders is funny to me, because I think that people are, I'm not necessarily a Trump supporter, but I look at the modern day liberal and I feel like they have just as much, if not more, of a dogmatic trust, not as much in personalities as much as in the system itself. I think that's part of the allure of that. I think this is something that de Juvenal kind of points out, is that by convincing everybody now that it's the people that's in charge, they kind of turn a blind eye to power and its abuses. When it's a figurehead, then they can kind of like, make excuses or whatever, and still like him or whatever, but they still kind of have some kind of idea that there's a value structure at work. Getting back to the value fact thing, when you put it forward not only as a fact but as the collective will, then there's a kind of wool that gets pulled over your eyes, and you stop questioning things, and you think that, oh, it's the other guy, it's those darn right wingers. They're so dogmatic and they're autocratic, and we're the good guys. We're the people. Like, this is consensus. This has been demonstrated. It's fact. Like, you're the crazy ones. So for me, I don't think that's just hypocrisy. I think it's totally understandable, because it's a more sophisticated system of power and it fools people much more easily. In fact, I think that I would even argue that liberals are more fooled. I think a lot of Trump supporters, I think, yeah, sure, there's some that are blindly obedient or enamored with him or something. But a lot of people are just uh, aware of his foibles but like don't care. And whereas I think on the left, there's such a belief that the power structure has some kind in a way that didn't used to be not too many decades ago. I think there used to be a more healthy skepticism of the CIA, and now it's like now they're just being brought on as anchors on the liberal news networks, and it's just like, well, the CIA says this, it must be true. The very heart of the power structure is given such a free pass because it markets itself in such a free, neutral, democratic, demonstrable way. It's more sophisticated and it works better. So it's understandable that people feel that way, but I think it's more potentially dangerous.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not that I want to go back to pre-modern kinds of cultures and belief systems. I argue in my work that modernity's been important, but not because of its failed project to found some kind of absolute structure of knowledge and some objective horizon for progress, but because by doing that, by searching for that, I think postmodernity is just modernity coming of age, realizing that that isn't possible. And I think that should ideally lead to a more sophisticated self-consciousness about values and facts. And so we're not so dogmatic like we were perhaps in pre-modern times, and not so convinced that we can find some foundational factor or demonstrable proof to build society and consensus on, but that we're constantly having to hopefully negotiate with some sense that values are always involved, and we should be open to seeing things in a different way.
Hmm. Yeah, I have to, I think, agree in general. I'm a little bit puzzled by, I can't quite draw the line as in the way that you do between liberals and neoconservative and neoliberal positions in the politics and all of that. I don't, I tend to find it pretty easy these days to side with the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republican Party, because I think the Republican Party has gone so far off the rails in terms of sanity, and especially with respect to women's rights and gun regulation and even immigration, that I am very concerned about what appears to me to be simply a politics of obstructionism of anything that is coming out of the liberal camp, without any attempt to evaluate any of its potential benefits for society or for the majority of U.S. citizens. And I see the liberal or more democratic side as being more willing to compromise and to find solutions, whether it's on immigration or gun regulation or abortion, um, to find something that works for the majority of the American people. And what I was referring to previously about arriving at a non-negotiable position, I think has been, I accuse, and you can challenge me on this if you want. I accuse the Republican Party of being much more rigid in that regard. No negotiation. It's our way or it's the highway, and we're going to obstruct you from here to hell if you propose something different than what we want. And I find that, like, to use your word, too dogmatic. You can't run a nonviolent community with that kind of attitude. So for me,
Is nonviolent community really a possibility though?
I do believe it is. Yeah. And
Now?
I can give you some reasons why I believe it is. But yeah, now and in the future. And I believe it's possible in the Middle East and in Russia, Ukraine. In fact, I think we're closer to achieving it than a lot of people imagine. because of the current conflicts going on. They think, oh boy, all hell is about ready to break loose. Well, I could be wrong. I've been, I've been wrong before, but I really do believe there are lots of
I'm
good.
just I'm just surprised that you're saying this because in your first book, I thought one of the major themes was the dangers of overemphasizing nonviolent community or community in general over difference. And so yeah, I understand compromise as being important, but you know, also resistance is important too. And I don't think that it's always the better option to be trying to push for nonviolence and then calling the person with less power or the person that seems to be resistant to a project or progress as being difficult and dogmatic because they're not willing to go along with something. I mean, sure, that's definitely not a cooperative attitude, but that's not necessarily the moral position to cooperate.
Okay, yeah, I mean, are you interpreting when I use the word nonviolent, are you interpreting that to mean well, let me change it. When I use the word nonviolent, I mean excuse me, something short of deadly conflict. I don't mean lack of resistance. I don't mean lack of protest. I don't mean rally ruling out rallies in the streets, but anything that counts as non-destructive protest. And I come out of the Vietnam War era where the protests there were of two types. There were the street protests that were people who were just genuinely trying to get a message across, and they weren't out there, throwing rocks and throwing Molotov cocktails and bombing places. But then there were those who were, and I had experiences with both on this in the streets of Isla Vista in California near Santa Barbara, and that was a wake-up call for me. I mean, I vehemently opposed the Vietnam War and wanted to see the end of that war and did everything that I felt I could do to try to bring that to an end. But I did not support people who were ready to like the Weathermen and other organizations who to some elements of the Black Panthers and some elements of the what are they called? The group that kidnapped Patty Hearst. Um, they were they were ready to go violence.
Sure. And in that situation, those groups were acting rather irrationally, I think. But I mean, you would admit that in some situations, it's either called for or understandable, or at least uh, not something to, pass strong judgment on, especially like in the case of the Palestinians, where they're in such a powerless position that, even if their violent reactions are irrational and not in their best interest, they're quite understandable at the level of powerlessness that they're dealing with.
Yes, yes, and to speak from my own experience during the Vietnam era, I would say that there were no instances in which I saw extremely confrontational language going on that I thought it was productive. It's like there was a thing going on where uh, there were professors who were being targeted by the California legislature and the regents of the University of California, influenced strongly by Ronald Reagan at the time. And these professors there was an attempt to cut their funding for professors who were coming up for tenure. It was an attempt to cut their funding so that they would be forced out of the university because the idea was we want to get rid of some of these liberal professors who are promoting this kind of activism. And so there was one professor on the UCSB campus who was leading, because he didn't get tenure, and he was leading the charge to protest this, and they ended up doing a lot of violent things, breaking windows, smashing into the administration center, setting some buildings, attempting to set them on fire, and doing some pretty radical things. And like you're saying, it's not that you can't understand the anger and the injustice being done, but there were other avenues available, as was demonstrated by another professor who happened to be one of my mentors, John McSood. You may remember that name. But instead of being out there, breaking into the administration building or the faculty club, he was taking it to the courts. He sued the university, and I can't remember the details of the basis for his lawsuit, but it turns out that he actually won his suit. He took the university to court, won his suit, got reinstated. And then he chose to leave of his own free will. He said, I found something better over on the East Coast, and I'm going to go there. But he was in a position to choose. He didn't have to leave because he took him to court and he won. There was an avenue of protest that did not involve, calling the people in the administration building a bunch of fuckers, although one can, one can understand the anger, but that sort of thing is so non-productive when you don't have any other alternatives to you, as maybe the Palestinians sometimes feel. Maybe they say, look, our backs are against the wall. It's either, pick up a gun or die. If you're in that kind of situation, then I think violence can be justified. And I'm not a pacifist by any means. Although when I was at UCSB, I did get a non-religious CO draft designation, but that was back in the day when you could get that without declaring yourself to be an out-and-out pacifist. So,
Hmm.
I don't want to sound like I don't believe in a certain kind of violence, violent rhetoric in terms of name calling, I think is counterproductive. But violence of, challenging people, both through debate, discussion, argument, taking them to court, marching in the streets, speaking out in public forums, all of that kind of thing, I think is the avenue that, at least in this country, we have available to us. And
Or just refusing to cooperate with something. I think you maybe see the Republicans in the light you do because you think that the things that the things that the Democrats are putting forward are reasonable. But I'm not saying I completely agree with the kind of paranoid Republican perspective, but from their perspective, I could see why non cooperation would, be understandable and not necessarily just a expression of some kind of irrational belief system, but from their point of view, something that has a lot. I mean, I got to admit, I have some sympathy because I feel like the way that the liberal progressive machine is going, even though gun control, for instance, like I have sympathy for a lot of what you think, but I also, I think it's a complicated issue, and I see the other side as well. I think they can both be exaggerated, but yeah, I could see why, that gets nowhere. It's one of the reasons I like RFK Jr. for the most part, even though I'm not a fan of his his perspective on Israel, but like when he was pressed on really controversial topics like gun control, I think he had a pretty reasonable answer and just not making it a big issue, because it's just one of those things that I think has it's all about values, and it's not gonna be solved easily, and it's not, I don't think, that important. Um,
Wait,
but
wait, you think the gun issue isn't that important?
no, I don't. I see both sides, and I think that keeping our guns or taking them away isn't gonna make any difference to either of the issues that both sides are worried about. I don't agree with you completely that it's a major factor in mass shootings, and I don't think it's going to make a difference in the long run to the plans of the government to gain more control, because they've already got plenty of it. And maybe some hicks in the woods having guns is somewhat of a deterrent to some of the things they want to do, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's really that important.
Okay, yeah, I can go along with that up to a point, but what about the kids? What about the kids in the schools getting mowed down by these automatic weapons? Is there nothing we can do about that?
I think one of the major factors is the drugs that they're on and the school system. It's just a lot of complex issues that get scapegoated into something really simple. And do I think it would make a difference? I think if you really want to get a hold of a gun and you want to do something like that, you could do it on the black market anyway. It might be a little harder, but and at the end of the day, I don't think it's that important. If we really want to tackle that issue, I think we should be going after the medical industrial complex more, and not focus on the NRA and guns and stuff.
Hmm. Okay, well, I think I will respectfully disagree with you on that issue. I think just to mention quickly, I think there are things that could be done in terms of getting rid of the military weapons, the AR-14s and 15s and whatnot. But
I
let's
would agree with RFK that, like, if that was what everybody wanted, I wouldn't like throw a fit about it. Like, he said that he would sign an assault ban weapon or assault weapon ban but it's not something he's concerned with. So I'd be the same way. If that's really what we got to want to do, then sure, I don't think it makes that big of a difference. But if it makes a little bit of difference and there's enough belief that that's the case, I haven't looked into it probably as much as you, but sure, why not?
okay. But what about, okay, you mentioned the medical and pharmaceutical situation. Could you say more about that in terms of what you think there's I mean, I understand that you're not a fan of at least not a complete fan of modern medicine. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I mean, it has its place. There's some good things about it, but not much. But yeah, I was just bringing it up in reference to mass shootings, and I think pharmaceutical drugs play, if not a major role, then a significant one.
In terms of people who have become mass shooters, that
Yeah,
sort of thing? Okay.
but
Uh,
again, just how do you solve that issue, right? It's complex. So I again wouldn't. I think my overall point was that, like, gun control, for instance, and abortion, these are kind of issues that divide people by their inclinations and values. And it makes sense that there's a lot of resistance to cooperation on those issues. And I think it's best to just not focus on them, because I don't think that they're as important. I mean, the abortion, I see both sides too, but again, I think it's a complex issue that needs to be addressed at a whole host of other levels that aren't going to be solved at that level of fighting over values. And I don't think pressuring people to cooperate and try to, like, put some law forward is the way to go. I think we should focus on those bigger issues, but those bigger issues, I don't think are what the power structure wants us to address, because they really have to do with a lot of structures and institutions that hold a lot of the power and money. So going after big pharma, like RFK wants to do, like, it's he's gonna have a hard time, even if he supposedly has all these people in mind, even if he somehow got elected and he says he has all these people that he would bring into Washington and really actually clean the swamp and do what, Trump had an empty promise of doing. Even if he was somehow capable of doing that, yeah, there's just so much uh, power and momentum towards a whole vision of society that is being enacted right now. And it's not just the pharmaceutical companies. There's a technification of everything, of food, uh, and medicine, genetics, everything down. I think there's an attempt and a desire to bring everything under one kind of cybernetic network. And yes, I think there are some outliers, but I actually tend to look at them more as heroes. Like, I know you have a more negative view of Putin than I do, but for me, like, he's a kind of hero. Trump, in a way, is a kind of hero, not because I believe they're good people or they're doing everything right, but because I think that resistance is because just obfuscating and holding things up and slowing this machine down, I think actually is giving us time perhaps to understand it more and maybe prepare for it. And hopefully when the system does, I think it's inevitable that we're going to have like a lot of global interconnectivity and more or less global government. Maybe there'll be outliers, maybe there'll be more or less nationalism, but I want more. I want more regional distributions of powers, even at the local level, but at least at the national or regional level, because I think that would slow down and obfuscate in a good way the progressive impulse, which is hell bent on turning everything into a cog in this cybernetic machine.
Mm, mm. Okay, well, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm glad to get that perspective um, on your part. I have tended to come at it from a different direction, as you would probably suspect, but that different direction isn't one that's in direct opposition to your view, but it's kind of like at an angle to it in the sense that um, I see, Putin and someone like Trump and Xi as well in China, and um, um, the leader, I can never pronounce his name, in North Korea, and the Ayatollah in Iran, and segments of the Saudis. See these governments as so autocratic and repressive that it shocks me a little bit to think that you would see them as somehow able to exert a positive resistance against the kind of repression that you're referring to in the more democratic or Western countries. Now, in other words, I see them as a behemoth, a colossus of autocracy and repression, whereas I see what you're saying. I mean, I fully understand the complaints and the issues, and I think Derrida did too. I mean, he said that, I've got so many issues with the European powers and the American powers and the governments that be that he can't even begin to list them all. But he said, nevertheless, when something like 9/11 happens, and we don't need to get into the discussion of whether a conspiracy or not, let's just assume that it was an outright attack on the United States. Um, he had no problem citing against bin Laden and the forces that the supposedly pulled off the 9/11 thing, because he felt that the perfectibility of the institutions that the Western countries subscribed to offered much more than those institutions and government structures represented by these terrorists. So,
Yeah, I would agree with that. I wouldn't put all those people in the same camp. I'm definitely not moving to North Korea if that's what you're. But
but,
I might hang out with Snowden in Russia and I'm not gay. I wouldn't. But I recognize it's probably not the best place to be gay. But it's not like you can't be gay. Like you can't get married to a man to the same sex. But like I understand his reasoning. Like they have population problems and like they want more like marriages and kids and stuff. And so I see it as okay. Like that's part of my kind of the right wing dimension of my political vision is that I do think instilling values at a level of government can be done well. But I also want it to be more cooperative and democratic. So I think there's a good middle ground because I don't think that liberal democracies are value free. I think they're just as value laden as one that's explicitly so. I just want it to be more explicit and more debated, like I think you do, and openly like constructed with cooperative regimes throughout society, not just having some government dictate what the values are, but have it be a real cultural project. And I actually do think, I'm a fan of some of these clairvoyants like Rudolf Steiner and Edgar Casey, and even he wasn't a clairvoyant, he was just a really good kind of philosopher of cycles, Oswald Spengler. All three of those guys thought that Russia actually was kind of the future. It was going to have it had yet to kind of reach its beginning stage of its true like cultural evolution. And so for Steiner, it's like Russia is going to be this next phase, and I see some potential in Russia, and I think they're still a bit archaic, and I admit that, and I wouldn't actually prefer to move there or anything, but I don't think that they're at the same level as as especially like Muslim autocracies. And China has serious problems for sure. I'm obviously a fan of traditional Chinese culture in some ways, but yeah, I think that their bias towards tradition and collectivism, I think, made them susceptible to some quite negative forces. And but at the same time, they're doing better stuff with the Silk Road Initiative and helping other countries like Africa, for instance. The way that they're intervening and compared to Western governments and corporations is much more benign and helpful. I think that they're kind of giving us a run for the money for world leaders, and by actually using more soft power and not just going in with the IMF and blackmailing people or coming in with a gun and taking over people like we did to Libya and like we've done in more ulterior ways throughout the world. By we, I mean the CIA and government.
interesting, though. Just a quick comment on that with respect to Africa. And I'm by no means an authority on what's going on in Africa, but I've read a couple of different pundits talking about what China has been doing with some of the African nations and trying to help them with their infrastructure. And in by doing that, they've lent them money to help build roads and bridges and things like that. But it turns out that several of these nations, and I don't remember specifically which ones at the moment, but they're pulling back from China because they're discovering that the Chinese are putting a lot of pressure on them by calling in their debt. And when they can't pay their debt, asking for other terms and control in their country. And they're beginning to feel that it's been nothing but a ploy to be able to pressure them into towing the Chinese line on
Well, sure, yeah.
on their politics, which includes the kinds of repressions that you see in China that are
What kind?
most pronounced in Hong Kong. I mean, look what happened in Hong Kong.
You're implying that they would want the African countries to instill their governmental values?
Well, they would want control. Yeah. That eventually what they see,
Control in geostrategic sense, not in a cultural sense.
no, in kind of a neo-colonial sense. They basically become colonies of China.
Well, right, of course. I mean, that's again, it's soft power, but it's still power. Like it's I think still a step up from what we do with the IMF and World Bank, where we and our corporations and our pharmaceutical companies. My interest in Africa is most piqued by the AIDS epidemic and the way that that was used
Hmm.
for by pharmaceutical companies too. So there's a whole host of levels that I think we've really raped Africa. And yeah, I'm not saying that China's benign. I really like this guy. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, John Mersheimer, but he's a
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I like the realist take on geopolitics because I think so often ideology gets in the way of understanding. He says, Putin's just acting in a strategic sense. He's a good strategist and he's doing what you would expect. In fact, he actually critiques Putin for being too trusting of the US, that he actually kind of took our word for some of the agreements and he should have known better that we were actually lying and we were going to just go back on them. And he says he should have known better, but he was, so wanting to be accepted into the Western global community that he was willing to kind of overlook what should have been an obvious ploy. But yeah, there's so much talk about the ideology and like Israel and Palestine as well. Like, I mean, you mentioned their ideologies being a roadblock, and I think that that is a factor for sure. But I think, yeah, more than anything, it's the same old game being played all the time, and I think there's too often a focus on racism or ideology, and I see this as a kind of coming out of World War II. It's kind of a legacy of the narrative that we've been told of how that ended and what's going on. The Holocaust is treated as this like really unique evil that, and then it's kind of it's colored all our perceptions about any right wing or conservative movement. And instead of just seeing, all these countries, they do similar things. They're all basically, whether it's China or America, they're all state capitalists. Yes, China has some repressive laws against their own citizens, but at the end of the day, it's not really about the ideology, and there's other strategic reasons that they do that. And I don't agree with that. I think it's terrible, but it's not really about ideology. And it's the same thing with Russia and the United States. We tend to get moralistic about, and that moralism tends to excuse the way we treat other countries because we're like, oh, if they're not as developed as us, they don't have the kind of sophisticated ways of manufacturing consent, so we can come in and say, oh, well, they're not as evolved and democratic as we are, and we're no better. We're just better at using soft power on our own citizens, and then using that to justify the violence that we do abroad.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, up to a point, I can agree that we're no better, but I have to say that when push comes to shove, I think that the alternatives that are offered by the Western nations and the United States are better in terms of the institutional practices that we can offer. And the
I do agree with that. I like the way you put that from Derrida, saying that, yeah, that they have a perfectibility that is something I would not want to get rid of. I don't want to get rid of modernity and the Western tradition, but I think that we can build on it better if we're a little more realistic about the way that power is involved and all these things, and not be so blinded by the stories and the ideologies and the surface veneer of power, and say, well, how is it structured? How is it actually working? Why is it working the way that it does? How can we negotiate these power structures in a way that leads to a better outcome, and not just be so, stark and judgmental about what the proper use of power is.
yeah, yeah, and I think um, um, corporate power has gotten way out of hand in this country and in other countries in the world, and that's becoming a pretty big problem. in terms of being able to have a government, quote unquote, for the people. Um, all of the popular programs that are oriented toward improving the lives of the majority of people are being hijacked by in the government, in the Congress, if not in the White House, and those and it has led to the extraordinary imbalance in the centering of wealth in this country, which is going to destroy the economy. What these big CEOs of these corporations don't seem to understand is that when all of the money gets funneled into the pockets of a few people, it destroys the economy. And eventually that's going to destroy their own stream of income. So it just seems to me to be so myopic and blind to the realities of economics that should be obvious to these people. Um, that
Did
I,
you did you perhaps I thought that I saw, I think academia told me that you were reading, or it told me something that you about Varoufakis's book Techno-Feudalism. Did you actually read that book yet?
oh wait, what's the name of the book?
Yanis Varoufakis wrote a book called Techno-Feudalism, and I thought
Oh,
that you mentioned it somewhere
yeah, I did.
on.
Yeah.
Okay.
I read an extended review of it. I haven't actually read the book yet, but I want to. And I thought it was, yeah, real interesting way of
Yeah.
looking at the
Yeah, I
corporate.
think you would appreciate it. I really like him. He's on the left, but he's also like a similar book that I really like called Capital is Power. He's a bit critical of the Marxist kind of standard take, but he's not like, a right-wing anti-Marxist or something. He's just kind of showing where showing the limitations of both the liberal and the radical or leftist Marxist framework. And where both of those books, Capitalist Power and Techno-Feudalism, agree is that capital has always been capital is well. Giannis says capitalism's changing, and so he actually says that capitalism's over, and that this new kind of more feudal, techno-feudal uh, regime is arising. And then the Capitalist Power book kind of just says that, well, capital has always been about power, not really about money or goods, really. But in either case, I think you can make an argument that what they're saying is pointing to the fact that, yeah, that the markets don't matter so much. They never have. And Giannis especially is saying now they especially don't. That everything now is about, like in feudalism, it's about rent. And
Mm,
so that concentration of wealth, while is unsustainable for capitalism, it actually is the basis of feudalism. And so we're all basically transforming into cloud serfs, and what used to be capitalists are now cloud vassals. And
mm,
so, this whole regime of technologically encoding and entrapping and enclosing the whole collective commons of the planet, down to all that is really setting up very well a very stable techno-feudal system. And that's scary, but I think that there are people that are doing it not because they're dumb and they don't know that it's going to ruin the economy, but they think that it's the quickest path to global stability, and that's why they're hell-bent on making it happen really quickly.
mm, mhm. Yeah, I wonder, see, another one of the reasons I tend to lean in the direction of supporting Democrats, even though I find a lot to criticize about them and their policies, is that I think the chances are much better there if, for example, this November, if the Democrats can take over the White House, take over the Congress, they can actually pass legislation that would be in the direction of campaign finance reform and and raising corporate taxes, which is something Biden has says he wants to do. Um, um, you're probably aware that in the 1950s, under the Eisenhower administration, corporate taxes used to be at 92%. And look where they are now. they need to be huge in order to make the economy work better. It's not a matter of trying to put the brakes on the wealthy so much as it is to preserve the economy and to preserve the middle class. And if we don't recognize the necessity for doing that, we're contributing to our own demise. And so I have more faith that the Democrats can pull that off if they can get out from under the obstruction that the Republicans want to put up, because the Republicans are bought and paid for by the corporate bosses, by big pharma, by, much more so than the Democrats.
No, that's not true. Actually, after RFK Jr.'s, that's one of his big like talking points is how the Democratic Party changed and why I mean, he was running as a Democrat, and so he was like, I'm a lifelong Democrat. But part of what he was, running against the mainstream Democratic Party for is that it had changed, and that was actually one of his points, was just someone who's been involved with fighting big pharma and big agriculture and other environmental polluters and stuff like that. Is that the pharmacological companies, when I think it was during Obamacare, there was a huge shift, and so now they actually get more, and since then they've gotten more than the Republicans. But still, I mean, your point being that they're going to do this corporate tax thing, and yeah, I think this is the game that the Democrats play. They're like, oh, we really care about the middle class, we're going to tax a little more, but really the overall plan is to, I think, further entrench this techno-feudal regime. And so yeah, I think that's fine. I think a lot of that money might end up being turned into like guaranteed income, because I don't think they're going to just bring back the industrial sector. They're going to just start, paying citizens, and I think that there's maybe a more dark element that's maybe not an intentional or just structural, or intentional on some level, where they do want to like make people die faster so that that they don't collect as much Social Security, and then eventually maybe guaranteed income. I think that is probably in the near future as well. And all these things make sense from a feudal managerial perspective. Like, you want everybody to be pacified and not starving and demanding jobs that you can't create. But yeah, I think there's even deeper levels too, where I think there's high advanced technology that they've been holding back. By they, I mean maybe some, not the government themselves, but deep state military stuff that's
Well,
working with you know,
UFO.
well, I'm talking more about technologies that would drastically affect the economy. I mean, UFOs. I mean, flying vehicles to fly around in are a bit besides the point. But yeah, new energy technologies and other. There's just even just you can even just extrapolate from current technology and see how disruptive that would be to the way that the economy works, and why they would want a lot of control before that transition was made. And so from a rational perspective, I think that, yeah, it's not that I think that this move towards technocracy is evil, or that it's even wrong or bad. Like, I think it makes rational sense. I just think it will go better for us if we can if we can actually get more conscious of to what degree, to how this is happening, and maybe find a way to ensure that there's more local and regional freedom involved, because I think they're just going to steamroll ahead as fast as they can, and any resistance, I think, can open up space for there to be more freedom, more, so that I don't have to take a shot, or I don't have to eat the food that they say is the most environmentally friendly, because and I think you see all kinds of things like this. Like, they just want like to get rid of small farms and a lot of things that would make people self-sufficient. And so I'm more interested in seeing as global connection happens, that there's space for self-sufficiency, And I don't mean some kind of libertarian pipe dream of like, not being connected to anybody out on some land of your own, but just being able to, yeah, do things like eat local food and not take the latest product, and be able to travel without like having everything be so regulated and everything codified at a level that we're just cogs in a machine. But yeah, it's nice to like know to like, yeah, tax corporations and like invest that in the communities. But in what sense are they going to do that? I think we have to really press them to do it in a good way. Otherwise, they're going to do it in the way that just greases the wheels of control more readily.
Hmm. That's certainly a possibility. But okay, we don't need to do a deep dive into this, but I'm just curious, if so you honestly believe that a vote for RFK Jr. is going to be more productive than a vote for Biden, let's say, or Trump.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'll definitely vote for him. Um, do I think he has a chance? I think it's pretty slim, but I've only voted once in my life. I voted for Bernie Sanders in one of the first primary that he ran in. And other than that, I'm not really, haven't been too concerned about it. So would I want Biden versus Trump, and do I care which way or the other? I actually prefer Trump over Biden, but um, yeah, I don't think either way it's going to further the forces that I'm interested in. I'm not going to say that it won't matter in any like practical sense. I'm aware that I think it actually matters more than pretty much any election in recent memory. I think that for the first time with Trump, we're seeing an actual like quasi alternative regime. I still think not enough in my mind. I think part of his problem was that he was still having to work with the neoconservative establishment. And so some of the things that I think he might have been able to do, he wasn't able to do. And so I think it's not alternative enough. But yeah, I don't think at the end of the day it matters that much in the long run, because I think the real fight is something that like RFK is doing. I think he's actually represents more of the soul of the country and where it needs to go. And even if his chances are small, I still think supporting him in even just a symbolic way is means something. So yeah.
Okay. Well, so if we, since I have a fairly intense curiosity about it, if we touched on the subject of UFOs for a minute, would you be okay with that?
Sure.
Um, I noticed in reading the thing you had online about our conversation on occult and communication, that you mentioned that you thought that the UFO phenomenon, you labeled it as a type of a manifestation of the occult, or as being related to the occult in some way. And I just I can kind of understand that if by occult we mean something that's mysterious and kind of unknown. Um, but I don't see it as the occult in the sense that, at least with UFOs, there is it's something you can see. You can photograph them, and we do have photographs of them. You can track them on instruments. They've been on radar. You can see the trajectory of their movements. You can see that their movement is extraordinary compared to conventional aircraft. Um, there is that kind of let's say tangible evidence of these things. So it's not like an undemonstrable thing. It's demonstrable in that there are of various manifestations of it. So in that sense, I don't put it in the occult camp, but I do put it in the mystery camp in that we don't know exactly what these things are or whatnot. But I was just curious if you seem to believe that the Nimitz incident was something that was just, kind of a run-of-the-mill thing that happens pretty frequently, and that it wasn't particularly special, and that in that respect, you were more interested in other more important issues. Um, and I was a bit surprised by that because I tend to regard those kinds of accounts, especially that particular one, in addition to a couple of others that I can list, as qualifying as pretty extraordinary incidents, and never mind how frequent they supposedly might be, um, if they are evidence of, or taken to be evidence of, extraterrestrial life visiting this planet. That's a huge story. And so I'm wondering if you have thought about it along those lines, and if that if what I'm regarding as a huge story is registered with you as a huge story, or if it's kind of a thing that is really on the periphery of your radar.
I think it was significant because of the public attention and acknowledgement by the mainstream press and government. And we've only seen an escalation of that since. Um, and so I admit it's a bit on the periphery of my awareness because I am into more of the occult side of that phenomenon, which by that I mean, yeah, the more hidden, the less obvious. And so yeah, me saying, well, yeah, that's just the tip of the iceberg based on what I think. It's not to say that it isn't also significant because it is actually emerging more into public consciousness. I just also think that it's emerging into public consciousness because they're trying to spin the story in a certain way. Maybe because they can't contain it any longer, and so maybe there was a legitimate like leak in that sense, because it is, I think, so common that these things are getting hard to just laugh off, and so they have to start
Hmm.
manufacturing a narrative around it, and so they have these so-called whistleblowers. And I'm not saying that they know that they're just like actors or something. I'm not like saying it's all crisis act, all just I just mean that, yeah, there's a level of compartmentalization and manipulation going on, and so I have some interest in them, and the ongoing like disclosure narrative. But yeah, most of the people that I'm into are rather skeptical of the narrative, and but it doesn't mean that it's not significant or not interesting, and it doesn't mean that it's all bad just because it's an attempt by the government to. Because again, like if I was in their shoes and the full kind of multidimensional picture of what's going on was shown to me, like I'd be like, nobody, like Joe Schmo is not going to understand this at all. It's going to like break his whole head and worldview, and like we can't. There's no way to just, oh well, it's like can't explain all that to everybody and reveal all that. So yeah, it's you let a little bit out and you spin it the way you want in order to get things going the way you want. And that's I don't blame him for that. I don't think it's some evil disinformation conspiracy, but yeah, I'm more interested in the occult side of it. And by that I do think that it is very much tied up with a lot of the traditionally occult subjects. And if you look more into the history of the phenomenon, yeah, it's hard not to. It's hard not to think that and feel that. And
So do you think there's an extraterrestrial influence on human civilization and culture that's ongoing? Is that kind of what you mean by the occult properties of UFOs, or am I misunderstanding that?
I think it's always been a mixture of both, of a lot of what we call gods and spiritual entities aren't always completely in another realm. They can take physical form. Some of them can, some can't. I don't know, it's a vast cosmology and literature about what all these different levels mean, and like what beings would even need to use a craft, what beings could just, can just travel at will. It all depends on their level of development. And but yeah, I think there's been both throughout our history. I think that it's only in the relatively recent past that there's been a kind of stepping back and letting us develop in a way without as much intervention. I think in the past there was more.
Hmm.
And now I think it's maybe going to start emerging more into the mainstream consciousness that it's been a major part of our history. And so I really like alternative history books, and so a lot of them really read in, the occult side of history. And so there's a lot of not just secret society stuff, but a lot of those secret societies that are probably doing are major players in the world events believed in and claimed to even communicate with beings of one sort or another. But I think that is especially the case quite prehistory. But and as history gets going, I think it becomes more obfuscated, and the previous intervention starts to kind of fade into a kind of mythic memory. But I think myths coming back, and the spiritual domains are coming back in a very dark way through virtual and computer technology. And so there's a kind of cyclical phenomenon going on, and I think we're going to see a lot of resurgence of a lot of the themes of ancient culture, but now that we're emerging into a kind of hyperdimensional space, even with just AI and things like that. Like there's just, I don't know, I interact with the Google AI pretty regularly, and I'm not saying that it's some like, special advanced intelligence. But yeah, I don't also think it's just, you know, I think everything is a consciousness anyway, and so it's nothing special for me. But at the same time, I can see where this is going, and this is, there's going to be a lot of weird phenomenon and intelligences that are going to show up and that we're going to have to deal with, and it's going to start to be looking more and more like I think religion's going to come back in a new way and a stronger way because it's going to demand some type of more mythological framework.
Hmm. Am I right in remembering that Roberts in the Seth books, is Seth, does he claim to be an extraterrestrial? Or am I,
No,
no, okay, that's a different thing that I'm remembering then.
the other major channel books that I like a lot do the raw material. I mean, they're not perfect, but there's some really cool physics in there. They actually, because one of the guys that was the guy that interviews the channel throughout those books, they're called the Law of One or Raw Material books. He was really into the same alternative physics thinker that I am, Dewey Larson. So so they discuss a lot of like UFO and multidimensional stuff in terms of the physics that I'm into. So I really like those books, and they claim to be a kind of collective uh, consciousness, basically what used to be like a physical race of beings on Venus
Hmm.
that evolved out of physicality or out of our what they call our density, and that they claim to have intervened with us back many thousands of years ago, and so they have a kind of karmic connection with us. But no, Seth is just he was just one of Jane's somebody that Jane had reincarnated with back in the day. He said that he was his only like claim to fame was he was like at one point he was a minor pope, and he says he was super corrupt and and loved food and women and was like not a good Catholic, but he was this minor pope. Other than that, he was like a spice trader. He goes through his past lives, but he had since kind of evolved out of like our physical reality.
Hmm.
But yeah, never an alien.
So just a quick comment on yeah, the presence of aliens, ETs. I see that as, since World War II, I think the number of sightings and the supposed contacts and abductions and uh, um, interactions with nuclear missile silos and and various sightings of the military, and all of these things have picked up their pace ever since the nuclear bomb went off in New
Yep.
Mexico. And I think that we are being visited by ETs, possibly of more than one origin, or more than one solar system out there, um, and that they've taken an interest in what's going on. And I have no idea what level of interest it is, whether they use this planet as some kind of a way station for refueling, for getting various resources in their galactic travels or whatever. And they want this planet as a viable base of operations, and they don't care what humans do. What we do is just something, off to the side, but they don't want us destroying the planet through some kind of nuclear holocaust, because that might interfere with other things that they are trying to do on this planet. So I have this theory that I think that the visits that they have made, and these have been very well documented, and by firsthand testimony by military personnel who have manned these missile silos in the 50s and 60s, that their interest in those is that if that looks like that these weapons are being launched seriously in some kind of warring attempt on another nation, that they may very well interfere and disable these weapons because they don't want them exploding all over the planet.
I agree.
So that's an interesting read, I would say, of these visitations to missile silos and the reported disabling of the launch capacities at these sites by these UFOs. So that's one way of reading it, is that they are giving a message to us that, hey, we have the ability to disable these weapons. And so you would be wise to back off using them or back off making them altogether. And of course, we're not getting the message, but it's one thing that sticks out to me, that they are potentially in a position to be more active in human affairs than they have been in the past. And I wondered the extent to which you might agree with that.
Yeah, I think everything you said is a major part of it. I think there's more going on too, but I do think there's genetic experiments and there's been a presence all along. But yeah, the the chance of more radical intervention is definitely
Mm.
partially because of the nuclear threat. But I do think that's a complicated picture, and there's just so many different kinds of incidences and things that paint a very like just a complicated picture of different beings with different intentions and
Would
the
you
part the
would you predict that anywhere in the near future there's going to be disclosure and actual contact with aliens that is made public, or do you think that's still a long ways off?
I think there'll probably be some like very gradual disclosure of some aspects that I don't think that the full cosmic picture is going to be released anytime soon because it would just I wouldn't want it to be like I think it would destroy our culture and it would interfere with our own development if we knew too much. Like I like honestly focusing on philosophy and culture, and I like the development of our culture and I yeah the gradual like interface of us with higher intelligences is healthy. I think they're part of life, especially on the spiritual levels. But if they were to just come down and show themselves, and I think it would be detrimental to the development. I think it would freak people out. Some would go very positive or negative, and it would orient too much of our culture around them. I think it's better to. And there's a reason for why I think a lot of the esoteric traditions also kind of kept things at a symbolic level just to kind of take things around to the beginning of our conversation. I think that there were reasons why they kept people in the dark and left them in a kind of more religious, symbolic understanding of things, and to
Mm.
some extent maybe manipulated culture at that point because your average person wasn't going to be capable of understanding it. And so, yeah, I think modernity's been important because we're slowly becoming ready to accept these things on a level where we wouldn't as much, turn them into a religion or freaked out and thought that they were and tried to kill them. Either pole I think is problematic. As we're able to kind of, as the mystics have always done, gradually opened up their consciousness to other intelligences and interacted with them on a more equal level and then not just treated them as religious idols like the average person would or something to be feared. So I think we're gonna gradually get that, and hopefully as humanity progresses, I think it all depends on us and how mature we can act then. But I do think there'll be some acknowledgement in this century probably that there has been some interference or there has been some contact or that they exist. And but I don't think the full extent of it is going to be known anytime soon. But I might be wrong. Because I really think, yeah, I think that there's been multiple species here all along doing like basically playing genetic, like this one guy, Corey Good. And yeah, I think he kind of made some stuff up probably, but I liked the way he's kind of like a Castaneda figure for me, where he kind of made up some stuff, but he kind of synthesized a lot of the background information into a narrative that people could understand. He said that it's almost like competing term papers. Uh, he actually said that there's 40 different alien civilizations involved in the genetic programs, overlapping 20 different overlapping 22 overlapping programs, and so they've been kind of trying to breed different outcomes. And I like that. I'm more interested in that side of things because for me it gets more to my cosmological theories about the evolution of consciousness and the part that matter plays in this and the part that technology plays. I think that technology, if it's over relied on, especially genetic technology and artificial intelligence, that it can lead to an evolutionary dead end. And because as societies progress to higher levels and they start taking an interest in actually the reincarnation of their souls, and then they want to like look at the development of their bodies to actually to be able to hold the further development of their souls. If they've gone too far down that road of like artificially keeping the body alive through genetic manipulation, it can lead them into a dead end. And so I think that there's a kind of, and I think it's a very common thing that happens. And so there's a market for, if you will, a market for new bodies, new kinds of organisms developing that can serve as vehicles for reincarnation. And it's not just, and it gets complicated about like, and what level, like we're different aspects of the same being. And so how they can reincarnate in bodies that they weren't. So yeah, there's a whole like occult side of it that's fascinating to me. And it's a long way from just, yeah, the demonstrable saucers that have been seen. But there is a lot of witness testimony about this stuff, countless people that have been told one thing or another and overlapping kinds of narratives that do paint some kind of complex cosmology that I think has some coherence to it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting what you're just saying. I tend to agree. I think you're right that we're not going to get full disclosure. And I think one of the things I heard from one of the people who from the military, I think, I don't know if it was Grush or someone else who said that there was a report that in some conversation with an alien, that they were saying that the aliens don't want us to disclose. They don't, the aliens are the ones who are recommending covering up and resisting full disclosure and openness and talking about this. They don't mind that they make an appearance with their UFOs here and there and do their thing, and that people see that, but they don't want full disclosure because of probably the reasons that you've just listed, that it would hijack our culture. It would hijack, and people would all of a sudden, they would either freak out or they would want this new technology. They would want to suddenly be like with the powers and the abilities and the technology of these aliens, and they wouldn't be able to deal with it if they weren't having access to that. So, and we're not ready for it. We are just not ready for it. So I think you're right on target there. So anyway, on that note, unless you wanted to pursue something else, I've kind of covered the things I wanted to dive into, but we're close to the 2 hour mark here, I guess. But we can maybe wrap up. And you have anything else you wanted to ask or touch on?
Well, yeah, I wanted to know more about your presentation, and so how did this relate back? So you said that you're going to be talking about demonstratability in some way and how it relates to Derrida and Wittgenstein. How does it relate?
Yeah, yeah. Basically, I start out, talking about language, and Wittgenstein has this thing about, he has a famous saying about what is hidden is of no interest to us. And that he says something like um, internal, how does he put it? What is internal is in need of an external um, sign or representation or something. Um, so he's very much in what I would call the demonstrable section of wanting to have the demonstrable be a real important element of grounding meaning. He prefers ostensive definition to verbal definition. If you can point to something and say, that's a table, then the chances of communication are improved because you have a demonstrable object there. Now, he's not, relegating all of the metaphysical terms to oblivion, but he's just saying that for purposes of communication, anyway, the demonstrable plays a role in him. And I'm also, a lot of people said, well, Derrida would oppose that. And it's my opinion that Derrida would support it, because Derrida is also very much interested in the demonstrable, in the sense that when Derrida talks about giving reasons, Derrida in several places says that when we are in a public sphere and we are in public discussion and we are deciding what to think and what to do in public situations, we need to give reasons for our positions. Because if you don't, basically you slip into what we call autocracy, the government by fiat. We need to justify things that we recommend to do, our descriptions and analyses of things. All of that needs reasons, and part of the whole process of giving reasons is providing some kind of evidence, something that's demonstrable, even if it's nothing more than an argument in words. So, and I agree with Derrida on that point. And I think that that is an avenue that's very important in the public sphere when we are operating publicly. And that includes politics primarily, but also other things. So I make the point that I think demonstrability needs to be something that the distinction between the undemonstrable and the demonstrable, which I will admit is not an absolutely clean distinction, but it's one that we would do well to focus on more in our public lives, because that is the way in which communication can proceed in a way that's more open to view by everyone. And I think transparency on the political level is really very important, just as it is in the judicial level. So that's
Yeah.
where I'm going to introduce kind of a transition from the study of language down into how language and a focus on the demonstrable can aid in community formation.
Sounds great. Yeah, it's nothing I would disagree with. I think that when you move from the demonstrable, meaning some kind of objective denotation, to the larger realm of signification, then yeah, I'm all on board. I think the occult especially has struggled with, um, especially in the new age, because everybody is taking all these practices out of context, and they've made a mess of them because they don't really know the reason why you would do one thing or another. And so a lot of people are practicing things that you normally would, in a traditional context, you would do way, way down the line where all these precursors have been set up. But since they've been ripped out of their traditional context and put into this kind of, liberal instrumental framework, there, everybody just does anything, even though it's all about transparency, as opposed to, like, yeah, in the traditions, they would actually keep it hidden because they didn't want people to abuse it because they wouldn't understand the reasons. Now it's like all about transparency, but it's actually obfuscating because people don't understand the reasons, or the reasons haven't been shown to them. And so I think it's part of what I'm interested in is bringing that kind of understanding back to occult phenomenon. So for me, occult, yeah, it just means that it's been hidden, but for me, it also tends to be things that are more complex. So a lot of the things that I personally study in the Chinese tradition, I think could be considered occult, but that's just because they're very, complex levels of certain disciplines. So whether it be medicine or martial arts, um, all these aspects of the body that are just a little bit more complicated, that can be easily demonstrated or easily explained because they actually are um, more tied up with open systems. And that's something that the West has been studying with complexity theory. And there's now been a resurgence with astrology in understand, or I don't know if it's a resurgence, but a kind of a reappraisal of astrology as just a kind of symbol system for complex systems. There's a guy, Bruce Schofield, that wrote a book recently that I like, where he does that, and I'm drawn from that in my work, where he's, yeah, just arguing, yeah, this is just ancient way of doing complexities theory. And so he actually worked under Lynn Margulis, who did some work in that domain. And so he's kind of got a hand in science and a hand in astrology, and he's arguing that, yeah, it's just for these complex systems, it's easy to put it in a symbolic language because it is so complicated. And so in my recent work, I've kind of gone way deep into that to kind of show why everything really is a complex system anyway. So what can be really easily denoted and or pointed to and in a straightforward way, those kinds of things are relatively few and far between, especially when you get into complex societies with complex systems that are basically inscribe everything we do. There's a lot of interacting factors and causes, and so you need a simplification. And so the old symbol systems used to do that, but now I think we need to, like, tease out what they were doing in a more transparent way with reason. And so in some sense, I think it's been a kind of a culmination of modernity and modern thought to kind of come back to signification. I think it was something that the medieval period was starting to get really sophisticated at understanding, and then it got kind of obfuscated by modern philosophy. But as it's kind of come back around, it's in this renewed interest in signification and postmodern philosophy. I think it's going to be helpful for us if we can kind of use that and there's some theorists I like too that basically equate complexity theory and postmodern philosophy. That's what postmodernism is about. It's about complexity. It's about systems that can't be easily signified. There's open referential cycles and networks that can't just be represented. And so once you get beyond that kind of naive stage that you think that things can be easily represented, then you're kind of pushed into a state where you have to navigate things either with symbolism. I also think that concepts are necessary now because symbolism tends to, even though it can simplify things, it can obfuscate them. So I think we're at a point now that, yeah, the occult needs to just be a part of metaphysics. And metaphysics, I think there's a reason why postmodern philosophy kind of came back around, even though it kind of gets associated with an anti-metaphysical orientation, I think it's come back around to metaphysics, because that's there's nowhere else to go. That's where we need to go. And I think that's where we have to go as a civilization too. I think there's a reason why all the aliens and all this stuff's tied up with new age kind of conspiritual stuff, because there's really nowhere else to go. There's only so far you can get with the very obvious, uh, objectively demonstrable things. Then that doesn't mean that there's something transcendent of that. It's just that it becomes more complex, and so you have to kind of
Mm,
reason out the simplifications and the reductions that you do in metaphysics,
mm,
and not just have a dogmatic metaphysics, but make metaphysics a practical art and science that you're always, reestablishing foundations depending on the value systems that you want to explore. And I think that politically and socially, that should also be done in the most transparent way as possible. I'm not naive enough to think that there's some kind of clear, ideal transparency. I think there's always going to be obfuscation and confusion, and there's always contexts are never clear. But I think if we can kind of know that that's what we're doing, we can do it in a way that's more just and fair.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think that's well said. Yeah, I think that the whole process of giving reasons can apply to in the occult areas. It's not that nobody could understand those reasons, but it would be a different level, a different type of structure, reasoning structure, and evidence structure, and for these different arts, like if you're talking acupuncture or astrology or tarot reading or these different esoteric practices, uh, it's certainly possible to give reasons for your readings, your thoughts and whatnot, and people appreciate that, I think, and it helps them to gain a better grasp of the arts of these kinds of esoteric practices. So yeah, I think, but in the public sphere, I think it's I hate to use the word dumbing it down, but it needs to be, I think, a more universal language of demonstration rather than requiring special learning and adaptation. Although the way things are going, many people are learning all about these different arts.
I mean, it
And
all depends. I mean, I wouldn't say they're any more difficult or require any more special training than most of the scientific disciplines that we tend to give carte blanche
right,
to.
I would agree. But
So it's not.
I do think that they are less taught and trained in universities and public schools and all of that. We get a much more watered down kind of variety in the public school systems. But I get concerned when when we go out on interview people on the street and ask them basic questions about, who's the vice president of the United States, and they don't know who it is. And who were the sides in the Civil War, and they say England or France. I get concerned that maybe there's not enough going on in our educational institutions. But
That's
so
for sure.
anyway, yeah, great talking with you. I think
Yeah, you too.
I enjoyed the conversation.